Despite my best efforts to remain a faceless, scentless beta servant, fading into the background, folding the Crown Prince's laundry, wasn't my destiny. As royal bells chimed, and the suffocating weight of 1,000 dominant alpha pheromones filled the grand cathedral, my illegal suppressants abruptly failed, drawing the new king's immediate gaze and exposing my darkest truth. My name is Oliver Davies, and for 3 years I lived a lie so dangerous it could have gotten me thrown into the royal dungeons. In the modern kingdom of Aldovia, the biological hierarchy is everything. Alphas rule the corporations, and the parliament, betas, keep the world spinning with their tireless, unaffected labor, and omegas. Well, omegas are prized, protected, and entirely stripped of their autonomy. If you present as an omega, your life is no longer your own. You are paired off to a high-ranking alpha, expected to host extravagant galas, bear airs, and look pretty. But I didn't want to be a prized breeding doll. I wanted a career. I wanted independence. Most importantly, I needed money to pay off the crushing medical debts my father left behind before he passed. So when I presented as an omega, at 18, I panicked. I didn't register with the National Biological Census. Instead, I turned to the black market. Through a shady underground clinic run by a man named Dr. Gallagher, I procured military-grade suppressants. They were brutal little blue pills that tasted like battery acid and ravaged my stomach. But they did exactly what I needed. They completely neutralized my natural scent, a sickeningly sweet blend of vanilla and crushed pine, and halted my heat cycles. To the world, I was a biologically neutral, unbothered beta. That fake status landed me a job at the royal palace. In the employment registry, my official title was chambermaid, an antiquated, heavily gendered term. The royal household stubbornly refused to update to valet. I didn't care what they called me, as long as the direct deposit cleared every Friday. I was assigned to the private wing of Crown Prince Julian. Prince Julian was the epitome of a royal alpha. Standing at 6'3", with piercing amber eyes and a jawline that could cut glass, he commanded a room without speaking a word. His pheromones were intoxicating, a heavy, rich scent of petrichor and sharp cedar that made lesser alphas submit and omegas absolutely melt. Because I was heavily medicated, I was supposed to be immune to it. I became exceptionally good at faking my immunity. Davies, Julian's deep voice rumbled one evening as I was meticulously arranging his ceremonial military jacket. "Yes, Your Highness," I replied, keeping my heart rate steady, staring blankly at the wall just over his shoulder. He walked into the dressing room, unbuttoning his tailored dress shirt. The sheer weight of his proximity made the hairs on my arms stand up. My suppressed omega instincts screaming at me to bare my neck in submission. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper to keep my posture rigid. "You're the only servant in this entire wing who doesn't trip over themselves when I walk in," Julian mused, pouring himself a glass of amber liquid from the crystal decanter on his vanity. He turned to look at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "The omegas in the lower courts practically faint, and the alpha guards get painfully stiff. But you're like stone." "I am simply doing my job, Your Highness," I said, my voice perfectly monotone. "As a beta, my biology affords me the privilege of focusing entirely on your itinerary rather than your pheromones." Julian let out a low, rumbling chuckle that sent a dangerous shiver straight down my spine. "Right. The reliable beta. Honestly, Davies, it's refreshing. I need someone level-headed around me right now. The coronation is in 2 weeks, and the palace is turning into a circus." He wasn't exaggerating. The old king had abdicated due to failing health, and Julian was set to take the throne. The stress was palpable. Hundreds of foreign dignitaries, rival alphas, and hopeful Omega suitors were descending upon the estate. The air in the palace was growing thick with competing scents, posturing, and political backstabbing. For me, it meant longer hours, less sleep, and a terrifying biological strain. The suppressants I took were strong, but they required me to maintain a baseline of physical health. Stress exhaustion and constant exposure to high-level alpha pheromones were known to metabolize the drugs faster. I didn't know it yet, but my body was slowly turning into a ticking time bomb. My only confidant was Liam, an actual beta who worked in the kitchen. Liam covered for me whenever I had to sneak out to Dr. Gallagher's clinic for my refills. "You look like a walking corpse, Ollie," Liam whispered to me one night as we sat in the servants' quarters peeling potatoes for the next day's royal banquet. "You're sweating." "I'm fine," I lied, wiping a bead of cold sweat from my temple. "Just tired. The prince has me polishing every piece of silver in the West Wing." "It's not just fatigue," Liam said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper as he checked to make sure the hallway was empty. "You're building up a tolerance to those blue pills, aren't you, Ollie? If you go into heat during the Coronation week with thousands of unbonded alphas roaming these halls, they will tear you apart." "I have enough pills to get me through," I insisted, though my hands were shaking slightly. "Once Julian is crowned, he's taking a month-long diplomatic tour. I'll have the West Wing to myself. I can crash and detox then." But reality is rarely that kind. The very next morning, my fragilely constructed world began to fracture. It started with a text message on a burner phone I kept hidden in my mattress. Gallagher's clinic got raided. Feds seized everything. "Lay low." I stared at the glowing screen in the dim light of my quarters, my breath catching in my throat. I only had a 4-day supply of suppressants left. The coronation was 7 days away. Panic is a funny thing. It triggers the sympathetic nervous system, increasing heart rate and body temperature. For a suppressed Omega, a spike in body temperature is the exact trigger that tells the body a heat cycle is approaching. I immediately went into survival mode. I halved my doses. Instead of taking 2 pills a day, I took one, hoping to stretch them out until I could find a new supplier. It was a catastrophic mistake. By day 3 of the half doses, the cracks began to show. My skin felt perpetually flushed. A dull, throbbing ache settled into my lower back. Worst of all, the artificial barrier blocking my scent glands started to thin. I was in the royal study, dusting the massive oak bookshelves, when Julian walked in, accompanied by his cousin, Lord Sebastian. Sebastian was a notoriously cruel alpha, known for his political cunning and his utter disdain for the lower classes. "The delegation from Prussia is demanding better trade terms," Sebastian was saying, his heavy, bitter coffee scent flooding the room and making my stomach churn. "You need to assert dominance early, Julian. Remind them who holds the military advantage." "I prefer diplomacy over chest-beating Sebastian," Julian replied coolly, taking a seat at his desk. I kept my head down aggressively, dusting a leather-bound encyclopedia, praying they would ignore me. But then Sebastian paused. He sniffed the air, his nose wrinkling. "What is that smell?" Sebastian asked, his eyes darting around the room. My heart slammed against my ribs. "What smell?" Julian asked, not looking up from his paperwork. "It's sweet, like burnt sugar and pine." Sebastian took a step toward the center of the room, his eyes landing on me. The predatory glint in his gaze made my knees weak. "It smells like an Omega in preheat. Why is there an Omega in your private study?" I froze the feather duster, trembling in my grip. I forced my expression into a mask of mild confusion, turning around slowly. "My lord, I am the only one here, and I am a beta." Sebastian stalked toward me, his towering frame casting a dark shadow over me. He leaned in entirely too close, his nose practically brushing my scent gland at the crook of my neck. I had to bite my tongue to stop myself from whimpering. "A beta," Sebastian murmured, his voice dripping with venomous suspicion. "You don't smell like a beta. You smell masked, artificial." "That would be the lemon polish, my lord." I lied smoothly, holding up the bottle of wood cleaner. "It contains natural pine extracts. Perhaps it is reacting with the damp air." Julian looked up, his amber eyes locking onto me. For a fleeting second, I saw something shift in his expression, a flash of primal curiosity that terrified me more than Sebastian's open aggression. Julian inhaled deeply, his chest expanding. "Leave him alone, Sebastian," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave layered with a subtle alpha command that forced his cousin to step back. "Davies has been in my service for 3 years. He is a beta. If you're smelling an omega, it's likely trailing off your own coat from whatever brothel you crawled out of this morning." Sebastian sneered, his pride wounded. "Watch your tone, cousin. You aren't king yet." He shot me one last lingering glare before storming out of the study. Once the doors clicked shut, the silence in the room was deafening. I hurriedly gathered my cleaning supplies, desperate to escape. "Davies!" Julian called out just as my hand touched the doorknob. "Yes, Your Highness." Julian stood from his desk and walked slowly across the Persian rug. He stopped just inches away from me. Up close, his petrichor and cedar scent was intoxicating, bypassing my weakened suppressants and hitting my brain like a physical drug. My breathing hitched involuntarily. Julian didn't say anything for a long moment. He just looked at me, his gaze tracing the flush on my cheeks, the slight tremble in my hands, and the beads of sweat forming at my hairline. He raised a hand, his large fingers gently brushing against my jawline. The contact sent a jolt of electricity straight to my core. "You're burning up," he said softly, almost dangerously. "Are you ill?" I think I am coming down with a fever." "Your Highness," I stammered, stepping back immediately to break the contact. If he touched me for a second longer, my knees would have buckled. "I apologize if my presence is lacking." Julian's eyes darkened, tracking my movement away from him. "Take tomorrow off. Rest. I need my most reliable servant in peak condition for the coronation on Friday." "Thank you, sire." I bowed quickly and fled the room. I didn't rest the next day. I spent it frantically scouring the dark web and making calls to shady numbers Liam had dug up, desperate to find replacement pills. I found a guy named Mickey across the city who promised he had a generic equivalent called Zeta blockers. I drained my savings account, took a discreet train ride into the underbelly of the capital, and bought the pills in a rain-soaked alleyway. They were cheap knockoffs. They didn't stop the biological clock. They merely put a fragile dam in front of a raging river. By Thursday night, the eve of the coronation, I was in agony. The Zeta blockers made me nauseous and dizzy. My core felt like it was filled with molten lead. The preheat fever was clawing its way through the medication, my body desperately trying to fulfill its biological mandate to mate. I lay on my narrow cot, clutching my stomach, gasping for air. Tomorrow was the coronation. The entire palace would be packed with hundreds of the most powerful dominant alphas on the continent. I was scheduled to stand right behind the throne during the 3-hour ceremony, holding the ceremonial chalice. I can't do it. My brain screamed. I need to run. But if I ran now, missing my shift at the most critical event in the kingdom's history, the royal guard would hunt me down for treason. A background check would be launched, my lack of census registration would be exposed, and I would be dragged to a government facility. I had no choice. I swallowed 3 of the cheap zeta blockers dry, praying to whatever gods were listening that the chemical dam would hold for just 24 more hours. When Friday morning dawned, the sky was a brilliant, unforgiving blue. The palace was alive with a deafening roar of activity. I put on my stiff, immaculate uniform, strapped a tight corset-like binder around my waist to alleviate the cramping, and sprayed myself down with neutralizing chemical spray. I looked in the mirror. My eyes were glassy, and my face was deathly pale, save for the unnatural feverish flush high on my cheekbones. I looked like a ghost about to walk into an inferno. I stepped out of my quarters and headed toward the grand cathedral, completely unaware that in a few short hours the cheap pills in my bloodstream would completely dissolve, and my life as an invisible beta would come to a violently dramatic end. The Cathedral of St. Jude was a sprawling Gothic masterpiece of stained glass and echoing stone vaults. By noon it was packed with over 2,000 of the most influential figures in the kingdom. The air was a suffocating, invisible battlefield of alpha pheromones, arrogant scents of leather dark tobacco, sharp citrus, and heavy musk, all violently clashing as foreign dignitaries and local lords postured for dominance. Standing on the marble dais, just 3 paces behind the grand golden chair, I felt like a man drowning in a sea of fire. My hands, wrapped in pristine white silk gloves, gripped the heavy jeweled chalice I was tasked with holding. My knuckles were bone white. Beneath my stiff, gold-braided uniform, my skin was slick with a cold, terrifying sweat. The cheap zeta blockers were failing. I could feel it happening in real time, a deeply internal unraveling. The artificial wall in my mind that had kept my omega instincts dormant for 3 years was dissolving, crumbling like wet sugar. Every time an alpha in the front row like Duke Harrington or Lord Cavendish shifted in their pew, releasing a spike of dominance, a sharp, agonizing cramp twisted my lower abdomen. My breathing grew shallow and ragged. A few feet in front of me stood Julian. He was a vision of absolute power, draped in the heavy velvet and ermine robes of state, his broad shoulders squared as he faced the archbishop. His scent, that grounding, intoxicating blend of petrichor and sharp cedar, was the only thing keeping me conscious. My suppressed biology was latching onto it like a lifeline, desperately trying to anchor my spiraling preheat to the strongest alpha in the room. Just 10 more minutes, I chanted silently, biting the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood. Just let them place the crown on his head, and I can slip out the back. Do you, Julian Arthur Windsor, swear to uphold the ancient pacts of Aldovia? The archbishop's voice boomed, echoing off the high-vaulted ceilings. I swear. Julian's deep baritone rang out, steady and commanding. The archbishop lifted the heavy diamond-encrusted crown. The entire cathedral held its breath. As the crown descended, touching Julian's dark hair, a massive collective cheer erupted from the congregation. The royal trumpets blared, and in that exact moment of deafening triumph, my biological dam shattered entirely. It wasn't a slow leak. It was a violent, catastrophic explosion. A wave of pure, unadulterated, desperate omega heat crashed through my system, buckling my knees. The chalice slipped from my hands, hitting the marble floor with a sharp, ringing clang that somehow cut through the roaring cheers. But the sound didn't matter. What mattered was the scent. Released from years of chemical suppression, my pheromones flooded the cathedral with the force of a hurricane. The heavy, oppressive smells of the crowd were instantly eradicated, replaced by a blindingly intense, impossibly sweet wave of warm vanilla and crushed pine. It was a scent designed by nature to do one thing: demand an alpha's total, primal attention. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. The cheering died in the span of 3 seconds, replaced by a horrifying guttural silence. 2,000 heads snapped toward the dais. The sheer concentration of sudden aggressive alpha arousal in the room hit me like a physical blow. Eyes that had been politely watching the new king were now dilated, blown wide, and black with feral instinct locked entirely on me. I collapsed onto the marble, curling in on myself, panting heavily as the fever spiked into a raging inferno. "An Omega," someone whispered from the front pew. "An unbound Omega in full heat," another voice growled thick with predatory lust. Chaos erupted. Decorum, politics, and logic vanished entirely, overridden by biology. Several high-ranking alphas broke from the pews, their canines extending, their eyes completely dark. The royal guards themselves, alphas, were trembling, dropping their halberds as they fought their own violent urges to claim the suddenly available prize. But the fastest among them was Lord Sebastian. He vaulted over the velvet ropes, his bitter coffee scent souring with aggressive intent. "He's mine!" Sebastian roared, lunging up the steps of the dais, his hand reaching out to grab the collar of my uniform. I smelled him first, the fake beta. I squeezed my eyes shut, a pathetic, high-pitched whimper, tearing from my throat, a pure sound of absolute submission and terror. Before Sebastian's fingers could graze my uniform, a roar so deafening, so earth-shatteringly dominant, that it rattled the stained glass windows, tore through the cathedral. Mine. A blast of petrichor and cedar hit the air with the physical force of a bomb. Every alpha in the room, including Sebastian, was violently forced to their knees by the sheer crushing weight of the new king's localized command. I opened my eyes, gasping for air. Julian stood over me. He was no longer the composed diplomatic royal I had served for 3 years. He was a feral beast. The crown sat slightly askew on his head, his ermine robes discarded on the marble. His amber eyes were practically glowing red, his chest heaving as he bared his elongated canines at the paralyzed crowd. Sebastian was on his knees, clutching his throat, choking on the oppressive dominance radiating from his cousin. "Julian, you cannot. He is a servant." Julian didn't answer with words. He delivered a swift, brutal kick to Sebastian's chest, sending the nobleman tumbling backward down the marble steps. Then Julian turned to me. The murderous rage in his eyes melted instantly as he looked at my trembling, feverish form. He fell to his knees, stripping off his heavy suit jacket, and wrapped it tightly around my shoulders, cocooning me in his overwhelming scent. "I've got you," Julian whispered, his voice, a gravelly, soothing rumble that sent a shockwave of relief straight to my core. "You're safe, Oliver. I've got you." He scooped me into his arms effortlessly, standing tall. He cast one final, lethal glare at the congregation of trembling, subdued alphas. "Clear the halls." Julian commanded the few beta guards who were still functional. "If any alpha takes a single step toward the private wing, execute them for high treason." Without another word, the newly crowned King of Aldovia carried his weeping, terrified maid out of the cathedral, leaving the entire global political stage in absolute ruins. I don't remember the journey through the palace corridors. My reality had reduced itself to the heavy thud of Julian's heartbeat against my ear and the intoxicating safety of his scent. When the fever finally allowed me to open my eyes, I was no longer in the servants' quarters. I was lying in the center of a massive, impossibly soft bed in the king's private sanctum. The heavy oak doors were bolted shut. The room was dark, lit only by the flickering fire in the hearth. Julian was sitting in a velvet armchair beside the bed, his sleeves rolled up, a cold, damp cloth in his hands. The feral edge was gone, replaced by a deeply focused quiet intensity. "You're awake," he said softly, leaning forward to press the cool cloth against my burning forehead. I leaned into the touch, an involuntary purr vibrating in my chest at the contact. I immediately slapped my hands over my mouth, horrified by my own biological betrayal. I am so sorry, Your Majesty." I rasped my throat raw. Panic began to replace the haze of the heat. "I ruined the coronation. I committed treason. I lied." "Oliver, breathe," Julian instructed gently, brushing a damp lock of hair from my eyes. "The coronation is valid. The crown is on my head. As for the treason, you and I need to have a very long conversation." I swallowed hard, curling into the massive pillows. "Are you going to hand me over to the biological census?" "No," Julian said firmly. He leaned back in his chair, his amber eyes locking onto mine with piercing clarity. "I'm going to ask you why the most diligent, intelligent beta in my household has been risking lethal liver failure to hide his true nature." I squeezed my eyes shut. "Because I didn't want to be property. My father, Arthur Davies, died, owing massive debts to Lord Cavendish's estate. If I had registered as an Omega, when I presented, the system would have flagged my family's financial ruin. I wouldn't have just been paired off. I would have been given to the Cavendish family to settle the debt. I would have been Sebastian's property." Julian's jaw tightened. A low, menacing growl rumbled in his chest, making the air in the room vibrate. Sebastian. The name sounded like a curse in his mouth. I procured suppressants on the black market. I continued, tears finally spilling over my flushed cheeks. It worked for 3 years, but last week the clinic was raided. I ran out. I tried to use cheap blockers. I thought I could make it through the ceremony. I never meant to cause a scandal, Julian. I just wanted to survive. I had used his first name without thinking. I braced myself for a reprimand, but instead, Julian let out a heavy sigh, running a hand over his face. "I knew you were hiding something," Julian confessed, his voice dropping into a quiet, intimate register. "I investigated Dr. Gallagher's clinic after the federal raid. Your name was heavily encrypted in the ledger, but I recognized the signature. I thought you were buying illicit beta enhancers to manage your stamina for the long shifts. I never in my wildest dreams imagined you were actively suppressing an Omega dynamic. You knew. Only pieces," Julian admitted, "until 2 days ago in the study when Sebastian smelled you. The moment I got close to you, I felt the heat coming off your skin. I felt the block in your scent glands. I knew then. I just didn't realize how close the dam was to breaking." "Then why didn't you turn me in?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why let me stand there today?" Julian stood up, pacing slowly toward the edge of the bed. He stopped near my feet, his gaze burning into me. "Because for 3 years you have been the only person in this palace who looked at me like a man rather than a crown. You didn't fawn, you didn't manipulate, you just cared for me. And over the last year, I found myself looking forward to seeing my beta maid more than any political advisor or noble suitor." He reached out his large, warm hand, gently gripping my ankle over the heavy blankets. The touch sent a rush of heat straight to my pelvis, and I gasped, my hips instinctively bucking upward. "Your heat is peaking, Oliver," Julian said, his voice thickening with a raw, undeniable desire. "The suppressants have completely vacated your system. You are going to be in agony for the next 4 days if you go through this alone." "I can't. You are the king." I whimpered, clutching the sheets, my body practically begging for him to close the distance. I am just a debtor. A servant. You are no longer a servant. Julian commanded the absolute authority of his alpha tone, washing over me, overriding every fear and insecurity I harbored. I am the king. I write the laws. As of this moment, the debt of Arthur Davies is forgiven by royal decree. The Cavendish family will never lay a hand on you. He climbed onto the bed, crawling over the mattress until he was hovering directly over me. His broad chest caged me in his intoxicating scent, wrapping around my mind, silencing every rational thought I had left. You are not a political pawn, Oliver, Julian whispered, leaning down until his lips were a millimeter from my ear. I felt the sharp prick of his elongated canines brushing against the sensitive skin of my scent gland. But if you'll let me, I would very much like you to be mine. The last remnants of my control snapped. I tilted my head back, baring my neck, completely offering myself to the only alpha I had ever trusted. Yes, I breathed. Please. Julian's teeth sank into my neck, claiming me, bonding us, and ensuring that the invisible beta who folded his laundry would wake up as the undisputed Omega consort of the entire kingdom. Did Oliver's desperate gamble leave you breathless, or did King Julian's fierce protection completely steal the show? If you loved the intense twists, the fake beta tension, and the dramatic royal rescue in The Royal Alpha, thought I was a beta maid, let me know down in the comments. Like this video, share it with your fellow Omegaverse fans, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon for more high-stakes, pulse-pounding BL audio dramas.